Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. So, where did we leave off? I believe we were at the priestess Kahana, and in the 802-701 established himself firmly in Quadradoria. He was able to do this, but not only by his Syrian troops, but because of his policy of working with the Berberin. Some tribes, like the Luratud, seem to have remained allies to the Arabs throughout many others came up over after the defeat of Kana, including her own sons. They converted to Islam and were enrolled in the Muslim Diwan, receiving a share of the spoils like the Arabs. And this was normal. The Arabs would go out, win wars, offer conversion, grant spoils of war, grant the ability for people to actually be a part of future conquests. Now, yes, I'm not defending Islamic conquests in any way, shape or form, because that just happened. It was in that time period. Remember, we're talking even before the actual Crusades and way before any of the kind of military conquests of later periods where civility of warfare was considered normal. By the time period that Islamic conquests were going on, Islam was probably one of the greatest forms of warfare for its time period. You remember, in the Viking period, before that predates, no, not the Viking period, my apologies, the Hun period that predates the Islamic period, they would butcher women, children, animals, everything. Complete fucking savages. So this is why when I've previously made comments about Genghis Khan and his level of savagery reminded people of the Dark Ages themselves. Hassan was dismissed by the governor of Egypt, who supervised the western provinces in 704, probably because he was too successful, and was replaced by Munum bin Nurist, a man of obscure origins who had risen in the financial administration of the Umayyad Empire. He continued Hassan's policies of recruiting converted Bermanists into the Muslim armies and using this new force to extend his control further to the west until in about 690 to 708, he took Tangier and appointed a Berbere supporter of his, Tarq ibn Zeres, as governor. The conquest of North Africa had been achieved by an alliance of Arabs, Berberids in the name of Islam. As the conquests proceeded, so an importance of the Berber contribution included. By the time the Muslims were conquering the areas of modern Morocco, it is probably that the great majority of the troops in their army were Berberids, newly converted to Islam. The Berber troops received shares of the booty, apart from the Tarquin where are we? Apart from Tarquin ibn Darsus Itangla, they do not seem to have occupied positions of political importance. So the Berberians at this time period did not hold positions of political importance. What they're saying is they were foot soldiers. They might have had the equivalent of a couple of sergeants, but all the officers were Arabs, relatively speaking. Many Berberians entered into Wala agreements with important Arab groups or individuals. They were then described as Mahoen of sort and sort. Tarquin Ibris, the Berberin governor of Tangier, probably a man of considerable importance in his own community, for example, is described as a Malwa of Musa B. Nusran, the Arab governor of Quarian. This relationship can be described as a sort of clientage by which members of the conquered people were converted. You could not be a non-Muslim Malwa and given a position in the Muslim community in exchange for their loyalty and support. These networks were very important in the fluid politics of early Muslim North Africa and Al-Andalus, and were often more useful than tribal followings in building up power bases. Both of the family of Ubakal bin Nafris and the Umayyads depended heavily on their Mawla to support their political ambitions. Basically, if you showed loyalty to the Umayyads, you were then promoted even though you were non-Arabs. So this is a time period in the Umayyads when Arab dominance of leadership was absolutely normal, completely historically as well. The governors, Way or Ahmeds, as the two Arabic terms used to describe this office, by contrast, were dependent on their authority of the governor of Egypt, and a change of command in Fusrat, Old Cairo, almost certainly meant a change in the Quawayan. This pattern became even more pronounced in Al-Andalus, when the positions of the governors was constantly threatened by changes of politics or personnel in Qualarian or Futat. In these circumstances, it was difficult for a commanding personality to establish himself for long, and the governors were often transitory figures who made little impact on the country. The conquest fed off further conquests. It is true that subject Christianity and pagan Berberians said to have been obliged to pay jizyn or poll tax, but there is little indication of any formal taxationable machine. See, there is this myth in Christianity that these taxes were always prolific. Western and Northern Christianity mentioned it, but the actual evidence of it is extremely rare. There's almost no proof of actually jizya being paid, and if it was paid when a noble Arab Umayyad or an Umayyad ruler physically asked that community at the time. Where are we? Taxable machines. Most of the soldiers must have served in the hope of booty and new lands rather than for a salary. And Muslim domination in North Africa had to expand to survive. If the booty dried up and no new opportunities appeared, then the groups and tribes would turn on each other. Where are we? Would turn on each other and disintegrate would eventually follow. The conquest of Tangier effectively meant the end of westward expansion. Now only Spain could offer the sort of opportunity the state needed to be able to survive. So these tribal groups made up the military, and there was no physical salary to them. So every time that they actually wanted to get paid, they had to conquer. And this was standard for all types of other large migrating warring tribes. The Hungarians did it, the Bulgarians did it in their time period, the Visigoths, who crushed the Roman Empire, did exactly the same. These tactics are perfectly prolific for that time period. Our understanding of Muslim conquest of Andalusia and the establishment of Arab rule is hampered by the nature of the sources. No contemporary Arab accounts of the conquest survives, and the early major sources which have been passed down to us are collections of historical anecdotes, akbars, preserved in a number of works dating from the 10th century onwards. Notably, the anonymous Akbar al-Majah collection of anecdotes from possibly the 940 CE and the Takbir Ifras Al-Andalus, History of the Conquest of Andalusia of Ibn Irists. Both these collections arrange their materials more or less in chronological order, but they are not annual and are more concerned with vivid interceding stories than the careful ordered events. The Akbar is particularly important for the pre-Umayyad period, whilst Ibn Aquarius gives vivid and gospel accounts of certain accounts of the Umayyads' armies. Now, this is a very true point involving Islamic history. Much of the early North African and conquistador history itself is marred by the fact that there was very little actual evidence towards it, because what evidence was there was normally held in Cordoba. When the conquistadors came through, they burnt the fucking place to the ground. So bad was the Inquisition that they killed Orthodox Christians who had been living in Cordoba for centuries under Islamic rule with no problems, none whatsoever. In the 10th century, the accounts were edited and systematically used to critique analytical historiography developed in the Eastern Islamic world by such authorities as Al-Madan Ibn, died in 839, and Al-Takabira, died 923. In Al-Andalus, this editing seems to have been the works of the Rezil family, originally from Reyes in central Iran, who had come to Al-Andalusia as merchants in the late 9th century. According to his son Isa, it was Ahmed B. Musa el-Razad, died in 955, who took the Akbar, which people in Al-Andalusia had not previously been very interested in, and ordered them down according to the rule of the historical science. The writings of Razier's father and son have largely been lost, but they were used and often incorporated entirely with the acknowledgement by the great 11th century compiler Ibn Hayyan. See, much of Islamic history in the Iberian Peninsula has to come from Christian sources, because the Christian world had burnt to the ground much of the Islamic history that was held in the Cordoba libraries. Huge sections of Islamic history were lost in Iberia. Like, we're talking truckloads, absolute truckloads. With the acknowledgement by the great 11th century composer Ibn Hayyan, much of Ibn Hayyan's work has in turn been lost, including the sections which dealt with the conquests and the early emirs. Some of his material has, however, been preserved in short works, like the anonymous Fayas al-Andalisa. If you haven't read it in Arabic, read it. The English translation is fascinating. The Faith al-Andalusia, 11th century, written by Ibn Hayyan. His attempts Islamically to write about what was going on in Andalusia is probably the earliest surviving fragments we still have. And later abbreviation recensions in analytical compilations like Ibn Aldin Bayan's almost of about 13th century. See, now at the 13th century, you're starting to actually see Andalusian history starting to be recorded properly. The facts that the sources as they have received us were written down at least 2 centuries after the events has meant the fierce controversy has raged about the relative merits and reliability of these sources. No, the reason that these sources are written 2 centuries later is because they're fucking reconquistadors. Opinions have varied between historians like Tarr on the hand, who accepted the Arabic narrative almost completely, and Collins, who had the Arabic translated tradition is virtually worthless. You see, historians cannot absolutely pay attention to what was done in Andalusia in its early periods simply because so much of it was destroyed. I cannot reiterate this iteration that the Spanish conquistadors, this is not the same as the current Spanish government or Spanish people, no hate to them, literally set fire to entire libraries. Entire personal records of Islamic scholars in their own homes were burnt. You know, they crucified hundreds, if not thousands, of clerics. It is important to attempt to assess the reliability of this material. Clearly, these Arab historians are biased in the sense that they are in favour of Muslim victories and claimed that they were the results of God's support, but there is some of the open partnership does not present real problems to modern historians. They are, however, a variation of other ways in which the materials need to be treated with caution. This is garbage. The reason we're treating this with caution is because the songs and hymns and the various other thematical in Arabic language that were maintained were because they weren't in Andalusia. The Christian apologist historians are refusing to acknowledge the fact that the conquistadors burnt down entire fucking libraries, slaughtering tens of thousands of Christians, Jews, and anybody who was in Cordoba during the siege of Cordoba was slaughtered. That was just the way the conquistadors and the Spanish kings operated on. This material, which is clearly legendary or folklore, I completely and analytically disagree with that. Largely the store of locked chambers in Toledo, which King Roderick was rash enough to open, only to find that the interior was covered by paintings of Arab warriors and probably the stories of Count Julian and the rape of his daughter by King Roderick. These stories, with their obvious prediction and entertaining functions, are unlikely to mislead the historians. They use the typography and convincible phrases, expressions, and characteristics borrowed from Eastern Islamic sources may also have given false impressions of detailed accuracies. Again, the people who are writing this book and many of its other counterpart materials are doing it from an Christian apologistical point of view. They have lost vast amounts of the source material, and this has been much of the problem that we've had in the history of Al-Andalus. There may have also been more hard-headed reasons for being economical with the truth. The nature of the conquest affected the status of the land conquered. If they were conquered by force, anawatan, they became the property of the conquerors, the individual affairs, immutable booty of the Muslims, and the procedure from these proportions were to be used for the benefit of the Muslims as their rulers see fit. If the lands were taken peacefully, Sulan, on the other hand, they continued to be absolute property of the inhabitants and would only pass into Muslim hands by inheritance, purchase, or conversions of the owner, in which case they would be the absolute property of the Muslim owners. There is some evidence of the two historical traditions within the accounts of these conquests. What they're saying is there is examples of parts of Iberia, Spain, being outright conquered by the Muslim conquerors and peaceful conversion. So they had a mixture of both, and the history was always very difficult about working out which. The first report by the Raziels and the other sources close to the Umayyads' court emphasises the forceful nature of the conquest, since conquest by force would give the Umayyads the right to dispose of the lands, wherever other accounts talk of takeover by agreements and so emphasise the right of the owners. This may account for disagreements in the sources about the nature of the conquests, and as such details of the fall of Seville, which is said to have surrendered peacefully and then rebelled and had to be subdued by force, may be explained as attempts to conflate two contradictory traditions. This isn't contradiction. Seville rebelled. The Umayyad ruler at the time was a fucking savage. He literally beheaded vast amounts of the Christian nobility. But then, what did you expect? You surrendered, you followed an honourable contract, a couple of years later you tear it up, throw it out the door. That's what happens, yeah? These are the time periods where if you were willing to do that, you better back it with steel. The fact that these sources, in the form in which they had been handed down to us, are much later, need not undermine their credibility. The Arabic historical tradition later laid great emphasis on preserving the wording and form of old accounts, and much of the work of compilers like Ibn Hayyan was basically editing and republishing old materials rather than composing a new account. Exactly. And again, much of those old accounts were, as I've already repeated multiple times. Much of the work of compilers like Ibn Harim will basically did that. Later chronicles can continue important nuggets of information which survive from much earlier times. The most important account of the narrative nature of the settlements of the Syrian Jews in Al-Andalus after 741, for example, is found in fragments of the Al-Andalus embedded in the late 14th century in Hita of Ibn al-Qatiyah, comprising its present form 650 years after the events is described. In addition, the Arabic texts, there are also Latin sources of those far the more important in these so-called chronicles of 754, also known as the Mozambique Chronicles. The Mozambique Chronicles have been ridiculed multiple times simply because of their inaccuracy and church favoritism. They was composed in Al-Andalus probably by the mid to 8th century. Not surprising, its viewpoint is very different from the one presented by the Muslim chronicles, and from a Christian author, the invasion is much a major disaster rather than a God-given triumph. There are differences over details, but there is considerable measure of agreement about the broad outline of events. Given it very early dates, the evidence of the chronicles of 754 must carry great weight. I disagree with that. And it is helpful that the tenets of the corroboration rather than the undermine of the ordering of the Muslim traditions. Now, the reason I disagree with that is because the chronicles have been proven to over-lavish what the Muslim world did. Because in Islam, you don't rape, you don't pillage. But the chronicles said that. The chronicles pointedly made clear that that was how you historically was to refer to the Islamic conquests. They were told, that the scholars were told to embellish it deliberately. Most of the early Arabic accounts of the beginnings of the conquests of Al-Andalus could tell of Count Julian of Cetra, perhaps a Byzantine officer with close connections with the Visigoth rulers of Spain across the Straits. He had sent his daughter, as was the custom among the Visigoth nobility, to the royal court to complete her education. Here she was assaulted by the king Roderick and complained to her father, upon which the outraged governor turned to the local Muslim commanders as an ally in revenge. Whatever the literal truth of this story, it is probably reflected a situation in which the Visigoth king Roderick was represented by an important section of the society who prepared to call in help from outside. We have no concrete evidence of Count Julius of Cetra's daughter being raped, the Byzantine daughter. What we do have proof of is a vast quantity of Byzantine Orthodox, well, they were Al-Andalusian at that time, at the fall of Cordoba. When Cordoba fell the last time to the conquistadors, there were hundreds and hundreds of families of Byzantine nobility. So, in my own opinion, I conclude that this was an arrangement that was honoured, that the Muslims were invited by the Byzantine Count noble because of his daughter being raped by a fucking Visigoth king. Now, the southern Visigoths were absolute fucking savages. I've said that many, many times. These were people who were rumoured to be cannibals. Most of the earlier lower past that. During the 7th century, the Visigoth monarchy was both elective and hereditary. In 693, Eragus had assisted his son Whitsun in his rule. And when he died in 702, Whitsun succeeded him as king. In turn, his attempt to do the same for his own son Akbar and gave him the governorship of Nabarine. But when he died in 710, there was a coup d'etat in Toledo, probably engineered by nobles who had no wish to see one of the family retain the crown for too long. Power was seized by Roderick, not apparently a member of the ruling family, who had able to defeat the army of Akir and his brother Alamendo and Ardaris. In terms of Visigoth's practicality, Roderick was probably a legitimate king by election, but the circumstances did mean that there were a number of influential people at the court who felt themselves wronged that might well have caused to scandalous stories about the new king to circuit. You see, this is again more Christian apologism. The reality is, when you look at it from an objective point of view, even outside of Islam, why were there thousands of Orthodox Christians living in Cordoba at the end of the conquistadors? Answer: because the Byzantines sided with the Muslims and asked them for help over the raid of the Count. That's all I have time for today. I hope you enjoyed my annotations. I do like the Muslim Spain and Portugal book, but it has a vast amount of Christian apology involving much of its historical interpretation, because it clearly and irrevocably makes clear that the Roderick king did not rape her, or it's giving that indication too, which is bollocks. Okay, because when you look at why the Byzantine, or what was at that point Andalusian Orthodox Christians, had survived throughout the entire Islamic period, you then realise maybe there's a grain of truth. Alhamdulillah, it's been a pleasure talking to you.